Good evening, everyone. I'm going to start this about 5 minutes early because I think I'm going to be a little bit jumbled. I'm really excited to talk about this evening, and I think you guys are going to enjoy this conversation too, for sure. This is something that somebody brought up last night during my stream talking about living in a blue city. I know you guys are skeptical about moving to a blue city and trying to have a positive influence there, but that's exactly what Andy and I are doing. We're here. It's too late. Pray for us. Send us your thoughts, wishes, prayers, tips, donations. I'm just kidding. Definitely keep us in your thoughts because we are really going to try to have a strong cultural influence, if possible. We'll see what happens with that. But somebody brought up the topic of the State of Jefferson, which has been really interesting to me for a really long time, but I've never talked about it. And since I actually have a platform to speak now, I really hope my audio works tonight. Make sure I don't mute myself here. It's easy to do with this microphone. Since I have a chance to speak about it now, I'm going to for sure. I've done a little bit of homework. It goes back a few decades. Kind of break down what happened there, why it was put on pause, and what might be interesting for people to do now, and whether this is actually a possibility for our current state of, societal unrest. Maybe this would be a good idea. I don't really know. And then I will ask you guys some questions about topics like secession, sedition, treason, stuff like that, because these are all topics that come up when somebody wants to form a new state or wants to secede from the United States. Most of you guys are going to immediately think about the Civil War when I mention something like secession. But this is something different. This is actually legitimate complaints that aren't morally unfounded, like a lot of the states during the Civil War were. As we know, slavery was definitely of conversation, and that's not at all the case here. So, a little bit of backstory. What happened with the State of Jefferson was that, I don't know if you guys know this, but the majority of the influence in California is in the central and southern part of the state because that's where the big cities are. That's where most of the influence is. That's where most of the people are concentrated. So from my understanding, the Californian part of the State of Jefferson, oh shoot, I meant to pull up an image of the actual state itself. Most of the population of the State of Jefferson would be located in Oregon, not in California. So let me find a picture of it. A lot of interesting history too. So we're going to talk about that for sure. Let's find a picture of it, and I can show you what it would look like. Yeah, okay, so this is the proposed Pacific state. Let me see if I can actually pull it up. So it's a bunch of different counties, and they've brought it forth a bunch of different times. There we go. All right, so as you can see, this red thing over here, this is actually, I think, the largest iteration of the State of Jefferson. As you can see, that red arm down at the bottom would not necessarily be included in the state itself. That really was a big ask, but for whatever reason, they thought it would be a good idea to see how many counties they could get involved. I know that they were able to get a lot more counties interested as they went on. So one of the reasons that they were looking at doing this in the first place was because they felt like they weren't represented. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with the American Revolutionary War, but the reason that the U.S. decided to break, yes, this is live, I'm live streaming, welcome to the chat, tell me what you guys think. One of the main reasons that the U.S. decided to break North America, decided to break ties, 13 colonies, with the UK was because there was taxation without representation. I'm not a historical scholar. You guys are free to correct me if you think I'm wrong. This is just from my understanding and from listening to a little bit about Benjamin Franklin recently. The U.S. did not like being taxed. They felt that the king was ignoring their demands, and they thought that they deserved a greater voice in what happened to them. One of the pivotal moves on that count was the Stamp Act, which was very heavily involved with Benjamin Franklin, who at first was fine with it, and then when he saw how much it was upsetting the colonists, the British colonists, the Americans, if you will, he realized that it was going to be a serious issue for them, and he began to vehemently oppose it. So given that that's what America left England over, I think it's fair to say that this needs to be considered when we look at the State of Jefferson. So there's a lot of energy for the state of Jefferson. The most recent attempt was in 2020 with the COVID lockdown. So this actually recently came up. And I meant to pull up a news article about that, but you guys are welcome to look it up too. I don't know if you remember all of the protests over the lockdowns. Everyone was unhappy, and I'm sure there was a lot of talk about the state of Jefferson and many such cases throughout the year. I personally, and you guys are welcome to disagree with me on this one if you like, but I personally think that this might be an interesting solution to avoid actual conflicts between states. And what's so interesting about the state of Jefferson is that although it is part of the state of California, because it's the northern part, like the farm part, there are many cases of people there believing that they were not being represented by their state representatives and they were not being heard when it came to the issues that they really cared about. And surprise, surprise, most of these counties up north, these agricultural counties, are heavily conservative. So obviously they didn't feel like California was really respecting their needs. Similar concept for Oregon, a lot more population there though. I'm not sure if Idaho was heavily involved. I think it was just a few counties in Idaho, but I won't speak to that because as far as I know, just mainly Oregon and California were involved in this conversation. So let's see. So this first started in 1941 when there were a handful of guys who were strolling around on a road blockade talking about how they wanted to secede every Thursday until their state was recognized. So they were stopping people in their cars and they were handing them their declarations of intent to secede. So I don't know if you're familiar with declarations of intent to secede, but this is what the states that were involved in the Confederacy filed when they were leaving the U.S. Union, which wasn't a great thing. But I think that the reasoning that the people of Jefferson, the people of the ghost state of this Jefferson, used to back up their idea of forming a new state was much more sound than, as we know, slavery, for sure. Their whole issue was, lack of representation, but I mentioned that earlier. The idea for the state of Jefferson should not come as a surprise to anyone. California and Oregon were both large states. People in rural areas of these states have long felt their interests weren't taken seriously or given enough representation in state governments. Because the counties of Jefferson border each other across California and Oregon state lines, these counties have much in common with each other, and the residents believe they would create a state that gave its residents what they need in a much better way than they are currently being served. Okay, that's fair. Yeah, I don't see any part of Idaho, just these states in California and Oregon. So a little bit of history. Back in 1941, the idea for Jefferson had so much support that young men from the counties that comprised the proposed state would gather weapons and patrol the state's borders on a weekly basis. They would stop anyone attempting to drive into Jefferson and hand out literature while declaring their intent to secede from Oregon and California as an independent state every Thursday until Jefferson was made a reality. I love it so much. I love that they had a day of the week that this is going to be happening. It's going to be every Thursday until this happens. The movement to make Jefferson a state had support in both California and Oregon state governments, and the governor was elected in preparation of Jefferson being given official state status. So they had people who were super gung-ho about this. Like, a lot of people felt very strongly about this. But a few things came up, a few obstacles were in their way. Just as a vote on making Jefferson a state was about to take place, the assault on Pearl Harbor happened and plans for Jefferson were scrapped so residents of all states in the U.S. could focus on the nation's participation in World War II. But this doesn't mean that the idea for Jefferson was forgotten. I wanted to pause and say here that I wonder if the war was viewed as a positive thing by people who were wary, W-A-R-Y, wary of the state of Jefferson because they knew that it would give the country a great sense of national unity. Let me see what you guys are saying before I move on, because there's a couple more interesting points. Yes, it's live. I'm not in a red state. I wish I could move to New Hampshire, Libertarian Dreamland. I'm not sure peaceful divorce is possible at this point, but it'd be preferable. I'm not sure either. I don't know what a peaceful divorce would look like. I do know what I discovered in the course of learning about Jefferson was that Congress has to approve of it. Let's see. California and Oregon would both have to approve of the formation of the state, which is very unlikely to happen because they're losing land. And I know that they say that they hate red America, but at the end of the day, I feel like California and Oregon both fully understand where their food comes from. They know the importance of having these agricultural counties for sure. But Puerto Rico and some of these other territories that don't receive any representation could also be, so if you wanted to make a bargain with Congress and you were to say something like, okay, we know this is a conservative state, but if you want to like make DC into a state, for example, maybe some kind of agreement could be made there, some form of compromise. As far as I'm concerned, that would just compound the concept of the national divorce, though. So maybe that wouldn't be a good idea, but it's a thought for sure if we wanted to actually turn this into a state. Let's see here. Mostly Oregon residents, very few California residents. It would be larger than New Mexico. It'd be the 34th most populous state and the 15th largest in terms of land mass. So it's not nothing. Like, it's not insubstantial. Let's see. Yeah, Northern California was feeling very disenfranchised. I don't know. I personally like this idea, but I don't know that there's any good way to do it peacefully. Somebody says Jefferson will not happen. They have no political or legal authority to do anything. They can put it on the ballot in their states, and they came very close to doing that in California. From my understanding, in 2012, they had 11 counties who wanted to secede. 2013, 11 counties wanted to secede. They just needed one more to put it onto the ballot. But like I mentioned previously, I doubt that the state of California would be cool with that. Somebody says California needs to break up. I'm inclined to agree. There was a time very recently that I thought that California itself was just a serious problem. But the more I learn about like the state of Jefferson, the more I'm like, no, it's not the state of California. It's Californian cities, Californian government for sure. Jefferson will not happen, but the secession to Idaho could potentially happen. How do you view that happening more likely than Jefferson? I kind of like the idea of a formation of a new state because when the colonies, they weren't colonies, my bad, my gosh, I'll figure this out eventually. When the states that were fighting the Civil War decided to secede from the Union, they were not forming a new state, they were forming a confederacy of states. And I wonder if the powers that be would view one state to be less of a threat than the Confederacy was. Definitely food for thought. I don't really know. This is just so interesting to me. I think that there's really potential here. And the fact that people have been thinking about this since at least 1941, I think is actually really cool. But it also speaks to the degree of lack of representation that people have just kind of lived with for a really long time. And it makes me wonder if Americans have always just been kind of willing to go along to get along. Like, oh, I have a family, I have to do whatever they say, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, you don't. If you really want and need representation, if you think your kids deserve that in the future, you absolutely need to speak up and make something happen. All right, let's see. I wonder if there's a legal path that the counties could follow to force the states to release them. I don't know. I like the idea of kind of bargaining with Puerto Rico or the state of Washington, D.C., because they don't have any representation either. There are territories that don't get representation. These people just feel like they're not fully conservatively represented by the state of California, which is, I don't think, any stretch to say. That's what was great about the United States. People could choose a state that aligned with their values and lifestyle. You know, that's still true. And I kind of like that. I do like that about the U.S. And people got so triggered over Roe v. Wade. I've always been such a huge fan of the 10th Amendment because I firmly believe that you should broadly say anything that's not specifically given to the federal government must be left to the states, because the U.S. has a really interesting system of giving its states certain amounts of power but not total control over what happens to them. Just because the federal government, I need somebody who's an expert in this stuff. I need somebody who can break down the difference between the federal and the role of the federal and the state and all this stuff, because I'm not super familiar with it. I thought delving into Jefferson was fascinating, though, because they were so gung-ho about making this happen, and their theme of not being represented is still holding true today. But like I said before, people apparently are willing to just go along with whatever. I live in Tacoma, Washington. Oh no, come back. Where did it go? Spokane is the second largest city in Washington state. It sits right on the border between Washington and Idaho. It's also a red city. That's interesting. I didn't know that about Spokane. I'm going to have to look into it. I lived most of life in Washington. The eastern side would happily join Idaho. Also, Oregon is sparsely populated besides the city. The Oregon coast is nothing but small ghost towns full of old heads. Interesting. That sounds really kind of fun to explore. Honestly, I know Oregon is gorgeous. Depending on what proposal you look at, it includes Idaho, East Oregon, East Washington, and a small part of Northern California for Jefferson or Greater Idaho. Most of the proposals are most of Oregon and Northern California, though. Yeah, so what you might be talking about there might be considered Greater Idaho, which is not something that I looked at, so I can't really speak to that. Colonial doesn't equal Americans. During the Revolution, a large part of the population moved to Canada post-war. So I'm not sure about that, but I do know that most Americans weren't really super excited about going to war with Britain, which shouldn't really be surprising, as that was all they knew, and they were unfamiliar with they were unsure what might happen to them without them. The country needs to go back to giving states more states' rights and strip power from the federal government. Oh, I completely agree. Right, so what I was saying earlier about Roe v. Wade was that what's great about living in a country like this with such big, weird, different states is that you're able to go exactly where the majority of the people align with your politics, if that's what you want. Now, if you're looking for a challenge, if you're trying to live life on hard mode, like apparently I am, you should move to a blue city or a blue state and kind of try to challenge people's opinions. I don't think it's impossible. I had plenty of people disagree with me in my conversation yesterday, and I'm completely fine with being disagreed with. But at the end of the day, I am where I am. I'm here for a reason, and I truly believe that something good will come of this. And I think that I just feel very positive about it because I know that people are flawed, certainly, because I was raised in a Christian background, the Judeo-Christian tradition. My understanding is that humans are fundamentally flawed and very sinful, just at the end of the day. And I am inclined to believe that's the case because you can see it from a very young age in everyone, and you can see it in the way that, states and countries are run. And it's very, very hard to avoid. But I also believe that people are wonderful, interesting, unique, complex, and created in God's image. So I don't like the idea of discounting people because they live in a certain geographical location. You know what I mean? Because that's really not the individualistic view that conservatives like to take. And I think that conservatives should cling to their individualistic ideas until the end, for sure. And I think that we should let each person speak to us on their own merits instead of judging them all as one group, Just my opinion. Oh, crap. This keeps jumping. This is kind of annoying. All right. Let's see here. Another event like the Battle of Athens is always possible. The Battle of Athens is fascinating, too. I just want a historical expert. Oh, here we go. I live in Tacoma, Washington. Would love it if Eastern Washington joined Greater Idaho. Would move to Idaho if I could. Yeah, you should definitely consider it for sure. Idaho seems awesome and beautiful. I used to live in Sacramento, and the culture is absolutely different from Southern California. Yeah, interesting. I don't think I've ever been to Sacramento, but we are going to be spending some time in California over the course of the next few months. Look up New California. Yeah, so this I don't think is an idea that is new for sure, but I think that it's something that needs to be handled by a super professional group of people who are just willing to sit down and be like, okay, so how can we attack this in a way that makes people want to join us in our quest? And how can we frame this to the blue parts of the state so that they want to let us go? I thought that was actually a really interesting idea. I was like, what if you could convince the blue cities, make some kind of deal with them where you could still have trade between the cities and the state of Jefferson, because I know that and I repeat myself, but I know that at the end of the day they're not stupid and they do know where their food comes from. So they would have to recognize that there's certainly an appeal to maybe allowing those counties to do what they want, because that would make them happier, which would make them more likely to, share what they create and what they grow. But I think that there's too much risk of retaliation if the state of Jefferson does become a reality. And I think that that's a very serious risk that they might not want to take. But I also completely understand. I was watching a Reason TV video from 2014, and they were just talking about how what they were saying makes complete sense. They're just like, we don't feel like the people who represent us fully represent us because they don't share any of our values. They go to Congress and they talk a bunch of stuff that we completely disagree with. And they don't like They don't like anything we like. We're completely polar opposites. So in what way would we feel represented? And I don't know if that's considered, I don't know if like what happened in 1941 would be considered a form of sedition because they were encouraging rebellion against the federal government. I don't think that's the case at all. I really view it as like they were more interested in how they could make their voices heard, less interested in causing a rebellion. But then this leads me to my ultimate issue with this, which is that I don't know that there's a way to do something like create a state like, you know, New California or whatever they're naming these things, or, you know, the state of Jefferson. I don't know that there's a way to do that without causing actual technical civil strife by declaring that you're now a new state. And I wish there was. I wish there was like a soft option for creating this kind of pull away. Like, I think that it should be something to consider for sure. I think that that would make the states who are in the union more likely to be like, okay, well, we will consider working with you just because we know that we have this nuclear option where we could just leave if we wanted to. But again, I'm not a founder. I didn't frame the U.S. Constitution. I didn't lay any of that stuff out. And I'm not a legal expert, so I won't talk much about sedition, which is defined as conduct or speech inciting rebellion against authority of a state or a monarch, which seems like such a tricky wording because if you even propose the idea of creating your own kind of thing, then they're going to call you seditious, which we've kind of seen even with the January 6th conversation, when really people like in the state of Jefferson, people on January 6th were asking for their voices to be fully heard and acknowledged. And I don't think that's too much to ask. I think that's fully fair. But I don't think you're going to get a fair shake. And I don't think that there's a good way to do this smoothly. But I don't really know what the future holds. What do you guys think is going to happen with the state of Jefferson? I don't know if you guys have seen anything recently. I looked for more recent news, and the most recent thing I could find was from the lockdown in 2020. Nothing really ultimately came of that. I don't think that anything is likely to come of that. Frankly, the fact that it's been an option, or they've been pushing for it since freaking 1941, is just absolutely ridiculous. It's too long. Like there's not enough impetus behind it to actually make it happen when it's been kind of hanging around for that long. It's just nonsense. It's before freaking World War II. And most of our veterans from World War II have now passed away, unfortunately. So it's just crazy to me. Whack the like button. Yes, do that for sure. People questioning me. The policies of blue states and cities have one inevitable outcome, third world condition, which leads to higher crime, lower standards of living. I grew up in Africa and I see the U.S. becoming more like it. Yeah, I saw an article the other day about a French train company that pulled out of California, some Californian city, because they said that it resembled a third world country. And I know that that's the case. And that's why I didn't move to LA, and that's why I wouldn't move to New York City. That will never happen. But there are cities that, like I said yesterday, are they're the physical embodiment of a person who's not fully convinced to be progressive, but who's kind of leaning that way. Somebody who could be negotiated with. And this, in my view, and this is a very important factor of what I want to be talking about on this channel, there are people you cannot convince. You will never change their minds. They're ideologues. These people are like LA and New York City. On the other hand, there are other cities that can be convinced. There are cities that aren't as far gone as these ridiculous places where we see such insane homelessness, such insane drug use. You know, in Portland, they're setting up more and more homeless shelters. They're calling them encampments or whatever silly fancy name they're using to kind of soften the concept that really they're just for homeless people, and they have so many of these people that they have no idea what to do with them, and they're not even trying. I was looking at these pictures from LA earlier today, just as a side note, and I was like, what is Gavin Newsom doing about this? Like, you never hear what California is doing to fix this problem. You really, really don't. And it's just like, I don't know if they're even trying, but I'm not entirely sure why they wouldn't try, because do they not care about the people who live there at all? Honestly, this has kind of been bothering me, because I'm like, what is it about Californian leadership that makes them just not give one single care about what happens to the people who pay taxes there. Like, you would think, we used to talk about this a little bit on Timcast IRL. I forget who it was that said that the government doesn't care about you. And Tim was saying, oh, the government does definitely care about you. They need you to pay taxes. That's entirely true. Like, the government in California cannot just take advantage of their... Although, I will say, I was going to say you can't just take advantage of your people and just expect them to keep paying taxes. But when you look at the state of Jefferson, people have been trying to work on this and thinking about it since 1941, and nothing's ever happened. So if the state of California can just use their taxpayers as much as they want and fix nothing and care so little about the state of their streets, and it's like... people are just going to live with it. They're just going to deal with it. And I know people are leaving the state, but at the same time, there's still millions of people who live even just in the LA area. Absolute insanity to me. But anyway, that's just what's recently blowing my mind. I have no idea what California thinks they're doing, but apparently it's working for them because people still keep paying taxes and Gavin Newsom keeps getting whatever plastic surgery, hair gel, whatever. We do have a way to change the forms of representation, but change should still be cautiously carried out. Too much change, too fast, can be dangerous to what we have built. Yeah, I think that's kind of what the founders had in mind by making it difficult for, well, I don't believe it was the founders, but I think that's why it's so difficult for a new state to form. I think that's what makes it challenging. They want you to deeply oh my gosh, I can't talk tonight. They want you to deeply consider what you're about to do before you pull the trigger. That's a serious consideration. Nebraska, born and raised, it seems like every time I visit a largish city, it is worse than the time before. A coworker of mine visited Denver over the weekend and said the whole place reeked. Yeah, so Denver's gotten really bad, and I watched that happen, and it was terribly sad because I remember when Denver was really fun. And there was not concern of crime, and there was not concern of homelessness, and then they legalized weed, and then they legalized mushrooms, or they decriminalized mushrooms, and it was just crazy. It reminded me of LA last time I went there. I live in Southern Oregon. So many people are moving here from California. It's nuts. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. Do you think Washington State is too far gone? Well, somebody mentioned earlier today, I just realized this during the course of this conversation, that Spokane is a red city. And that's something that I did not know. I'm going to have to look into that for sure because I have a confession. I love that part of the country. It's absolutely beautiful. And I completely understand why people would want to move there because it's just gorgeous. It's just gorgeous. I can't talk. I'm sorry. The only issue there is, of course, their big city. Like you have Seattle, which is a huge problem. Seattle is starting to look more and more like Portland. It's a very, very... I don't know what exactly they think they're doing. And I don't know why they think that they can do this and expect people to just keep voting for them. But I guess we'll find out over the course of midterms how their policies are paying off for them. I don't think it's going to end well. I don't think that people like the crime and violence. I don't think they like the inflation. Although, again, I won't speak to the economics. But at the same time, the crime and the violence affects everyone. Like there was a lady who was leaving her home and a carjacker jumped in her minivan with her kid in it and tried to steal it. Total insanity that affects normal people. It's very much like inflation in that, well, inflation is sure to affect every single person, whereas violence is more than likely to happen to someone who's just trying to exist in an inner city location. And this typically affects people who are poorer. Obviously, this affects people who can't afford, private security and people who have to live in the city in order to be close enough to work to afford to live. Like, it's very challenging. It's a serious issue. But at the end of the day, I do like the idea of everyone just ditching big cities. I do think, and I've pitched this concept before, I do think that living on top of each other creates this kind of insanity. Like, it's a self-feeding loop where people just start to view each other as obstacles. And you see this a little bit. I believe that this is why the denizens of New York City are rude to each other and they're rude to other people and they seem to take some kind of pride in it. And I think that's because they live too close together and they just see each other as, speed bumps. They're like, you're in the way. I don't care about you. Get out of my way. I have to go to work. And on some level, I sympathize because you live with too many people. Like, what are you supposed to do about that? It's just a thing that you have to deal with every single day. All right. Landlords, trending Sunday. There are reasons why nothing gets done. The rich get richer after the poor paid for what they never owned in the first place. Passive income, ? I don't know. And I will say that my parents do own property. I fully respect landlords. I think it's very important. At the end of the day, people need a place to live. If you don't have landlords, you don't have a place to live. And you want to talk about a homeless population. If you don't give the working poor a place to live, where are they going to go? They're going to end up homeless, or they're going to end up like living stacked on top of each other like sardines illegally where they shouldn't be. Like, that's no way to be, honestly. That's just putting people at greater risk. That strikes me as a bit like prostitution, where you're in a really difficult situation and it's really hard to get any kind of legal help for it because you have no recourse because you're stuck. You know that what you're doing is wrong. This is why a lot of times underage kids won't report if their drinking buddy has drunk too much and ends up passing out and sometimes getting brain damage. It's a serious issue. You don't want to create situations where people know that they're doing wrong and are afraid to seek some kind of help. There are many cases like that in the US. I don't think that living situations should be like that at all. I respect and appreciate landlords, and I know that sometimes you have to raise rent because that is what the economy does. When inflation goes up, costs like that go up, and it's pretty straightforward, but I feel like we should have somebody on to talk about that for sure. I don't like the idea of dissing landlords, and I think the concept of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer is one that needs to be examined very carefully, because Jordan Peterson talks sometimes about the issue of inequality. And he's correct that it's a big problem. Like, it's not something that you can ignore. I feel that the left handles it very poorly and backwards, and I feel like the right won't talk about it at all. I think it's actually one of those issues that both sides could 100% be handling better. Gavin isn't going to try because he's going for the Iron Throne of the presidency. Yeah, so I don't know if you guys saw this, but he actually had a scandal break today involving Harvey Weinstein and his wife. So that's fun. I don't think he's going to get that presidential nomination after that, but I guess we'll see. They did nominate, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, so, whatever. All right, Spokane is a decent city. Its homeless problem is due to Seattle voters. Yeah, many such cases. Some of these really bad policies can spread to other places. No, they need to stay in the cities. They're moving to the country and messing things up. Okay, so that's the other problem. So you guys know how Tim's always talking about getting out of cities. So when you get a city dweller who's lived in the city for their entire life and they move out to the country, what are they going to do? Are they going to make the country more red, more agricultural? No, exactly what happened in Colorado and what's happening in Arizona and Texas is what's going to happen to these countrysides. If you bring blue voters into the country, they're just going to vote exactly like they do in the cities and nothing will change. Everything will that's not true. Things will change. They'll get actively worse. It's not good. People come to California and San Francisco because it's warm and the laws are lax as well, and free food. Homeless come from many states. Yeah, so that's one of the things that I was mentioning here earlier today when we were out and about. I was noticing that there weren't tons of homeless people, and when there are homeless people, they genuinely look like they really could use help. Like, they're not just out for fun. They're not building their little homes under the bridges and you can't move them. They actually are really disturbed and in need of professional help. And that's because the weather isn't great. When you see somebody in a cold city who's homeless, you know that they don't have any other choice, which I think that California, of all states, should have the harshest laws about homelessness and should take the greatest possible measures to make sure that homeless people are cared for, required to work, helped through drug programs, and otherwise, seriously attended to. Whereas what Gavin Newsom has done and what some of the DAs in LA and San Diego or San Francisco, I can never remember. San Francisco. Yeah, sorry. What they've done is make it more friendly to these homeless people. And this is why Joe Rogan got in trouble for saying that you would get in less trouble for shooting a homeless person than you would for kicking their little tent home or stealing their stuff. Everyone was really outraged about that because they're like, oh, it sounds like he's saying that this is something that should be done. And I was like, no, he's literally saying the laws are so lax that you will get in more trouble for taking a homeless person's stuff and trying to move it so that you can get your car by than you would for actually committing an act of gun violence. It's crazy to me. And he was correct. Nobody was taking that into account and nobody really talked about that. I wish that I had my channel at that point because I would have loved to have broken that down. The most profitable and successful businesses are the ones that take advantage of the poor. I don't know if that's true at all. I don't think that's the case, although it is true that if you can convince someone to part ways with a little bit of money, sometimes you can make a lot more money than you would otherwise. You're almost at 10,000 subscribers. I am. And you know what else? We are halfway to our 4,000 watch hours so that we can monetize and take super chats. I cannot wait to be able to take super chats. I really feel like it gives the chat, I feel like it gives the chat that kind of more official stance. And that's why I can't wait to get there. But I still love reading the chat in general. And I like that everybody can just throw their thoughts at me willy-nilly. If you put too many people in one place, you'll begin seeing your neighbors as objects. People don't feel bad about committing crime against objects. Exactly. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with Terry Pratchett. I love him. He's a wonderful British author. He wrote books that are so funny and so acutely observed human nature. He was very libertarian, and he had thoughts about, whether guns should be illegal. He had thoughts about whether people were basically good. He had thoughts about, the wisdom of crowds. And he would talk about how he would talk about how the cardinal core of sin is viewing other people as objects. And I've been kicking that thought around in my head for probably about 4 or 5 years now. And I'm increasingly convinced that is the correct take. I really think that's true. You guys can tell me what you think. Do you think that sin is treating people as objects? Because that would be exactly what big cities end up creating between their own denizens. You need 4K to be able to send super chats. That's correct. We're at a little over 2,000. So I think that by the end of the month, we should be good to go. I was wondering why I couldn't give you my money. Don't worry about it. You'll have chances in the future. I would live for a year homeless in Reno, Nevada until I got my first job. Yeah, these things happen. Sometimes it's hard to go from living at home or from one job to another, especially if you have something like a felony in your background or any kind of addiction or difficulties like that. Life can be hard, don't get me wrong, and I have nothing but sympathy for people who are genuinely homeless for really unpreventable issues. And I think that the homelessness we're seeing in California is so often an issue of choice that even if you give people the option to stay in a halfway home and to be sheltered or whatever like that, they're still going to say no. This person says sin is disobeying God. Right, how do you disobey God? Is it a case of looking at the people that he's created in his own image and saying, you are an object that I will use to my own end? Because that's what it sounds like to me. That's why I think I love Terry Pratchett, because he thought really, really thoroughly about all this stuff. He was so great. He did not graduate high school, but he ended up being knighted by the Queen, and he created his own sword for that knighting out of meteorite. So he went and he gathered the material, and then he made it himself. So that's a little side note about Terry Pratchett, whom I would firmly recommend all of you guys read. Is thinking of mindless people as NPCs thinking of them as objects? I don't think so. Some people, it's really hard to tell. So I firmly believe that all people have a soul, but sometimes it's really hard to know for sure. I personally believe that everybody is made in the image of God. Oh, got hair. Which means that obviously everybody has a soul. And we all have similar flaws, similar shortcomings, similar things that will make us happy and help us find meaning. But I don't know. You can look at sin that way. The other way it's often looked at is that the root of it is selfishness. Of it all is selfishness. Yeah, so I think that you could easily confer those two concepts. Oh, you're an object. Yeah, that means I can use you to get exactly what I want. That just sounds like selfishness and narcissism to me, honestly. Sin depends on individuals' relationship with God and the conviction that God places on people. The Holy Spirit definitely speaks to us individually. Possibly so. I've never felt the Holy Spirit speak to me, but I do believe in some kind of overarching good. Somebody says if you smoke, I'm not sure what that's in relation to. Fear of death is one of the biggest causes of sin. Possibly so. You have more than 1,000 subscribers per video now. LOL. That's awesome. I'm so excited for the future of this channel, guys. I was going to try to make today Good News Tuesday because I saw a few different treatments for Alzheimer's. Oh my gosh. Speaking of Alzheimer's, for Alzheimer's and MS that target some of the proteins that build up on the brain. Because both of those are affected by debris that ends up accruing on the brain. I don't know enough about it to really speak to it. But my good news for this Good News Tuesday is that there are super cool new treatments that they're coming up with. And I think that they're going to be good in the long run. I'm really excited for future treatments that we come up with. And for all this kerfuffle with COVID, I love the way science has really made our lives so incalculably better. And I say this as somebody who has to take medicine 3 times a week, very painfully, to make sure that my lesions in my brain don't continue to grow. And I find that to be incredibly exciting. I find this great. I'm very grateful every day. First of all, I'm grateful for every day that I can wake up and I can walk. I think that's a wonderful thing. I'm grateful for hand-eye coordination. I know that I still lose track of my words easily. That's fine. I'm not too worried about that. I also have MS and I'm excited about this. Yeah, look it up. This is really good news. It's like they discovered a little, I forget what it was called. They discovered a little molecule or protein or something that was affecting both the brains of people with Alzheimer's and the brains of people with MS. They're like, oh gosh, I wonder if we can make a treatment out of this. So I think that that's really, I personally find that really uplifting. But at the end of the day, you guys, all I had to do was look for like 30 seconds to find something for Good News Tuesday. There is good news everywhere. You just need to look for it. And I think that if you start to look for the silver lining on everything, you're going to find it and it's going to make your life palpably better. So I think I'm going to leave you with that for sure. I feel like that's a good place to wrap it because the state of Jefferson is fascinating. Sure, we'll see if that's possibly a viable way out of this cultural mess we're in, but I don't know. And we've just been kind of waffling about it for so long. Who even knows if anything good is going to come from that? I am kind of distressed by the state of California in general, but I know, and I've been telling everybody, they're like, oh, I wish California would just go away. I'm like, you realize how many conservative people live in California, right? They have a huge population, and not all of them are leftists, so... All right, I will leave you on that positive note. I did say Terry Pratchett. I love Terry Pratchett. You guys should check him out. He wrote like 30 books, I think, a total of 28 or 30. He was always incredibly sad that he never made it as big in the US as he made it in the UK. That was one of his biggest regrets in life. So if you guys have an opportunity, go check him out. He writes hilarious, satirical commentary on... I don't even know how to explain him. I would call it a form of fantasy. It's a kind of science fiction. It is satirical. It's very much commentary on the human condition. And he's so funny. And he writes a keen story. He writes a killer, plot. And he's just one of a kind. Yeah, Discworld. That was the parallel world. So I will leave it there for now. You guys keep looking for the silver lining. You guys can tell me more about that tomorrow. I think I'll try to live stream again then. That's always really fun. I always love reading the chat and hearing what you guys are thinking. But until then, bye guys.